Villa del Valle was a quiet little town where time seemed to slip by without hurry. Its narrow, cobblestone streets wound between old stone houses, their balconies covered in colorful flowers. In the heart of the town was a small square, lined with cafes and local shops, where the residents gathered after Sunday Mass to chat about life, the weather, and local news. The mountains surrounding the town offered a pastoral backdrop, with fields of golden wheat stretching to the horizon. Atop the central hill, dominating the town's landscape, stood the imposing Church of St. Michael, built from pale stone, its towers seeming to touch the sky. For the people of Villa del Valle, the church was not just a place of worship, but the town's focal point, dictating its rhythm. The tolling of the bells at dawn and dusk signaled the beginning and end of each day, while the priest's words were law for many of the faithful. But while most of the town's youth embraced this orderly, predictable life, there was one exception. 17-year-old Javier saw each morning as just another day of imprisonment he needed to escape. With his perpetually messy dark hair and defiant posture, he walked the streets with a look of disdain. Javier was never one to conform. After his father's sudden departure when he was just a boy, anger and a sense of abandonment had started to grow inside him. His mother, Mercedes, did what she could, working long hours at the local supermarket to keep their home afloat, but an ever-widening chasm separated them. Communication was almost non-existent. All that was left were occasional glances, full of frustration. Javier spent most of his time on the streets with friends who shared his disillusioned view of life in Villa del Valle. At night, they gathered in an abandoned park, away from the watchful eyes of the town, where they spoke of their dreams of living somewhere where life wasn't governed by church bells or the town's strict morality. For Javier, each fight, each rebellious act, was a way of screaming to the world how hurt and invisible he felt. On the other side of this small town, Isabel led a very different life. At 16, she was the daughter of the strict father Mateo, and her life revolved around the church and religious activities. Her father, a devout and respected man, had lost his wife years ago, and since then, he had devoted all his attention to his daughter and the religious community. Isabel, in turn, helped with Mass and catechism classes, and was known for her kindness and sweetness. Many in town saw her as a role model. Isabel walked through the streets of Villa del Valle with a soft smile and an air of tranquility. The town's elderly women often commented to one another how she was a girl of faith, someone who never seemed to be shaken by life's hardships. But few knew of the doubts and uncertainties Isabel harbored in her heart, particularly about what lay beyond the small, sheltered world in which she had always lived. Although she was seen as a figure of peace, Isabel didn't feel entirely at home in the town. Inside, she longed for freedom and was curious about the world beyond the hills surrounding Villa del Valle. At the same time, she felt the weight of expectations, of the life her father had mapped out for her. To him, Isabel embodied everything he believed in, a young woman dedicated to faith, morality, and the righteous path. She was aware of this and, out of respect for her father, rarely questioned her position, hiding her true emotions. Villa del Valle was, for Isabel, a place of safety, but also a kind of silent prison. And for Javier, the town was nothing more than an open cell from which he wanted to escape as soon as possible. The destinies of these two young people were about to cross in an unexpected way, and what seemed like just another phase in their lives was about to change forever. Their meeting was set to happen when Javier was forced to perform community service at the church school after getting into yet another fight with the local boys. As part of his punishment, he would have to help with activities for the children and take care of small repairs at the school. For him, this seemed like just another humiliating punishment, something he would do with resentment. But what he didn't know yet was that in that environment, so far removed from his reality, he would meet someone who would completely change the course of his life. Meanwhile, Isabel continued her routine at the church, unaware that a rebellious young man would soon enter her calm and somewhat predictable life. What began as just another church duty for Isabel and a tedious obligation for Javier would soon turn into something far deeper and more complex. Villa del Valle, with its quiet streets and apparent tranquility, harbored inner dramas that were slowly about to surface. Javier woke up each day with the same weight in his chest. The sound of the church bells seemed to mock him, reminding him of the unbreakable cycle of his life. The house where he lived with his mother, Mercedes, was always in disarray, reflecting the inner chaos Javier tried to mask with his defiant attitude. Stained walls, old furniture, and a pile of unwashed dishes in the sink were his constant backdrop. Mercedes left early for her job at the supermarket and returned late, too exhausted to attempt any meaningful interaction with her son. Between them, Conversations had become rare and mechanical, limited to questions about dinner or overdue bills. At 17, Javier already carried a heavy burden for someone so young. When his father left without explanation, he had been just a boy. But the wound opened that day had never healed. Since then, Javier had turned that pain into anger, and that anger guided every decision he made. He had given up on getting close to people, or forming any connection that required vulnerability. To him, opening up meant setting himself up for betrayal again. But that anger only isolated him further. At school, Javier was known as the troublemaker. Always involved in fights, his grades plummeted, and slowly he was shunned by other students. The few friends he had left were as disillusioned as he was, but their friendships were shallow, based on destructive behavior and a collective attempt to ignore the pain they all carried. Among these friends was Luis, his closest companion, who shared the same rebelliousness against everything and everyone. Luis had lost his mother and lived with an alcoholic father, making his defiant behavior a means of emotional survival. Together, Javier and Luis got into trouble, filling their empty nights with cigarettes and plans for a future that seemed as distant as it was impossible. The breaking point in Javier's troubled life came when he got involved in an incident that resulted in damage to a local merchant's property. It was the final straw for the town authorities. The local policeman, who knew Mercedes and understood her struggles as a single mother, managed to arrange an alternative to jail. Javier would have to perform community service at the local church school under the supervision of the volunteers who took care of the children. For Javier, this punishment seemed worse than jail. Cleaning the school, dealing with children, and obeying the religious volunteers was something he would never have chosen. When he arrived at the school, dragging his feet and with his usual look of contempt, Javier barely noticed Isabel. She was one of the volunteers, always discreet, dressed simply, and with a calm demeanor. For someone like him, who avoided any kind of emotional involvement, Isabel was not a girl he would look at twice. She seemed so ingrained in the world of the church and responsibilities Javier despised that her presence didn't interest him at all. Isabel wasn't like the girls he knew, the ones who hung out in the same places as him, full of impulsive attitudes and ready to challenge whatever came their way. Isabel was the opposite, modest, kind, and seemingly unconcerned with what others thought. She walked the school halls carrying books and organizing materials for the children, always with a shy smile on her face. To Javier, she seemed like one of those people who lived in a bubble, incapable of understanding what the real world was like, what it was to feel anger, pain, and abandonment. Her life seemed so different from his that at first, he barely noticed her. To him, Isabel was just another girl caught up in the world of the church and volunteers. He had no idea that she would soon become much more than just a simple presence in the school. Javier arrived at the school as he did every day with his usual scowl. Every step inside that place felt like he was serving an unjust punishment. The school was a simple building, with large windows that let the sunlight flood in, illuminating the halls filled with children running and shouting. He didn't care about any of them. To Javier, it was just temporary torture, a prison disguised as community service. His tasks were mechanical, sweeping the floor, arranging books, and organizing materials for the classes. Nothing that required much mental effort, but enough to irritate him. Everything there seemed dull, and time dragged on, as if the world was trapped in a bubble. The children's voices echoed through the halls, constantly reminding Javier of his own childhood, a time he preferred to forget. Isabel was always nearby, supervising the children and helping with activities. She wore simple clothes, never drawing attention, and her calm demeanor contrasted with the noise around her. To Javier, she was just another person in that monotonous environment. He hardly looked at her. In another situation, Isabel would have gone completely unnoticed. Javier only cared about serving his time and getting out as soon as possible. That afternoon, after finishing sweeping one of the classrooms, Javier went to the storage room to grab some cleaning supplies. On the way, he crossed paths with Isabel, who was carrying a stack of books, trying to balance them without dropping any. Javier glanced at her briefly but kept walking, ignoring her completely. "Could you help me with this?" Isabel asked calmly, standing in his path. Javier rolled his eyes, clearly annoyed by the interruption. He wasn't there to be anyone's helper, much less for a girl he barely knew. However, he knew that refusing would mean more trouble, and all he wanted was to avoid more punishment. "Fine," Javier replied dryly, grabbing some of the books from her hands. He carried them to the room without saying a word. Upon arriving, he slammed the books on the table, making a loud noise, almost like a silent protest. Isabel followed him, watching with the same calm expression she always had. "Thanks," she said, seemingly unaffected by his attitude. Javier didn't respond. He just shrugged and left the room, heading back to the hallway where kids were running back and forth. That week, each workday seemed longer than the last. Javier kept to himself, focused on finishing his tasks quickly so he could get out of there. One afternoon, he was cleaning a classroom when Isabel walked in, organizing materials for the next activity with the kids. "Do you like working with kids?" Isabel asked, trying to start a casual conversation as she arranged books on the shelves. "No," Javier replied without looking up, continuing to sweep the floor. "I'm only here because I have to be." She smiled faintly, though Javier couldn't see. Kids can be exhausting, but it's rewarding to see how much they learn, even from the little things. Javier paused for a moment, leaning the broom against the wall and looking directly at her. "I'm not here to learn anything. I just want to get out of here." Isabel didn't seem surprised by his response. She simply continued her work with the same calm demeanor. "Well, sometimes things happen in unexpected ways," she said softly, placing a book on the shelf. "You might be surprised." Javier didn't like what he heard. To him, it sounded like yet another attempt to make him see something positive in the situation, and he hated when people tried to improve his life with optimistic sayings. He picked up the broom again and finished cleaning the room in silence, ignoring Isabel completely. The next day, the same routine repeated itself. Javier kept doing his work automatically, uninterested in what was happening around him. Isabel was always there, handling activities with the kids, but Javier avoided any interaction beyond what was necessary. To him, it was just another part of the punishment. He was counting the days until the community service ended so he could return to his normal life, far away from that place. However, the kids seemed to like him, even though he made no effort to please them. Some followed him around, curious, trying to strike up conversations, but Javier didn't pay much attention. He was there out of obligation, and his only goal was to finish the work and leave. One day, while helping organize art supplies for the kids, Isabel approached him again. This time she held a notebook and a box of crayons. "Do you draw well?" she asked, holding out the notebook to him. Javier looked at the notebook with disinterest, took it, and flipped through the blank pages. "I don't draw," he said, tossing the notebook back on the table. Isabel picked up the notebook again, unfazed. "That's okay. The kids love drawing, but it's not always easy for them to start." He shrugged, clearly bored. "That has nothing to do with me." Isabel gave a small smile, something between patience and acceptance of Javier's reluctance. "Sometimes, helping is simpler than it seems." Without responding, Javier returned to his work, cleaning the table and arranging the chairs for the next activity. The feeling of discomfort stayed with him whenever Isabel tried to get closer, as if she was trying to connect with him in a way he couldn't, or didn't want to, understand. To Javier, she was still just a girl who lived in a world completely different from his own. There was nothing she could offer him, and he had no intention of letting her words or behavior affect his indifference. At this stage, Javier had no intention of changing or understanding Isabel. To him, she was just another part of the scenery surrounding this imposed punishment. But the interactions, however minimal, were beginning to happen, and fate would force this coexistence to grow in unexpected ways. Time passed slowly in Villa del Valle. But for Javier, the days of community service seemed endless. Every morning he woke up with the same heavy feeling in his chest, dragging himself to the school just to get his obligations over with. The mechanical work bored him, and the company of the kids wasn't something he sought or appreciated. He did the bare minimum to avoid more trouble with the police and the school staff. Isabel remained a constant presence, always calm, always focused on the children. Javier saw her but didn't look at her. To him, she was part of the background, someone who lived in a completely different world. Her attempts to get close were met with indifference, and her efforts to talk didn't move him. To him, it all felt like a control game, where the goal was to turn him into something he didn't want to be. Even so, Javier couldn't avoid a few interactions. The simple fact of being there every day, sharing the space with Isabel, meant their paths occasionally crossed. One day, while he was arranging chairs for the next activity, Isabel came into the room with a group of children, holding a box of colored pencils. She knelt down to help one of the girls pick out colors, and Javier, who was sweeping near the door, overheard part of the conversation. "I want to draw a dog," the girl said excitedly. "That's great," Isabel replied with a warm smile. "What color will you make the dog?" "Black, like my grandpa's." Javier unintentionally glanced at the scene for a moment. The ease with which Isabel interacted with the children stood in stark contrast to his own childhood experience. He had never had that kind of attention, never felt comfortable enough to be a child. He had grown up too fast, forced to adapt to his father's absence and his mother's emotional distance. But before he could dwell on those thoughts, he returned to his work, ignoring any feelings that might arise. The last thing he wanted was to get pulled into an environment that felt, to him, superficial and fake. Later that same day, Javier was called by the school principal to do an unusual task. One of the art supply cabinets was stuck, and she asked him to fix the door. He rolled his eyes, but had no choice. He grabbed the tools and headed to the storage room, where Isabel was already organizing some boxes of books that had been recently donated. "Hey," she said, without looking up from the boxes, as Javier approached the cabinet. "Hey," he replied curtly, not really wanting to start a conversation. As he worked on the door, Isabel continued with her tasks. The silence between them was filled with the sound of paper and boxes being moved around. Isabel didn't try to force a conversation this time, which in a way relieved Javier. He hated feeling like people were trying to save him, or worse, get close out of pity. Still, something about that quietness bothered him. After a few minutes, Isabel broke the silence. "You know you're here because they believe you can change, right?" she said calmly, still arranging the boxes. Javier stopped working on the door and looked at her with skepticism. "And who says I want to change?" Isabel looked up and gave a light smile, one of those he was beginning to recognize. "No one can force you, but maybe you want to." He didn't respond right away, just went back to working on the cabinet, forcing the screwdriver into the jammed hinge. "I just want to get this over with and disappear." Isabel didn't push further. She simply kept stacking the books with her usual calmness. Javier felt like the conversation had been left hanging, unfinished, but he wasn't willing to continue. She was different from anyone he had ever dealt with. Isabel didn't react to his provocations or defensive attitude, and that bothered him deeply. It wasn't common for someone to be so indifferent to his attempts to push them away. In the days that followed, Javier began to feel a growing discomfort. Without realizing it, he was being led to think about things he had always avoided: who he was, what he was doing with his life, and why. Suddenly, Isabel's presence was starting to creep into his thoughts. It was as if something was changing around him, but Javier wasn't sure if he wanted to follow that path. He felt that if he allowed any sort of closeness, he would end up giving in to a world of vulnerability he had always avoided. And to him, that idea was terrifying. He had spent years protecting himself, building a wall around his heart, and now, a simple, quiet girl, who he would never have looked at twice, was subtly starting to break that barrier. One day, during his break at work, Javier sat alone on a bench outside the school, watching the children play in the yard. The sun was strong, and he pulled a cigarette from his pocket, lighting it with a bored expression. As he took a drag, he saw Isabel walking out of the school, heading toward the children to call them back inside. She noticed him sitting there but didn't say anything, just waved from a distance. Javier didn't wave back. For a moment he wondered what kept her from giving up. She knew he didn't care, that he was only there out of obligation. Still, she didn't seem bothered by it. Did she really think he could change? Or worse, did she pity him? Javier didn't know what to think. But one thing was clear. Something was starting to shift in his mind, and he didn't like it. Javier now found himself at a crossroads. He could keep acting the way he always had, ignoring Isabel and her attempts at interaction, shutting himself off in his own world of anger and resentment. Or he could, against his will, give in to the curiosity that was beginning to stir within him about her. After all, who was this girl who never seemed fazed and stayed the same day after day? Javier didn't want to admit it, but she intrigued him, and that curiosity bothered him more than he cared to admit. That afternoon, as he walked home with his hands in his pockets and his head full of confused thoughts, Javier realized he wasn't as indifferent as he wished. Isabel had become a constant presence in his life, and he knew he couldn't ignore her forever. However, he was still far from making any decision about how to deal with this. For now, he would keep his distance, protecting himself from what he still saw as dangerous territory. Caring. The days in Villa del Valle followed their slow, steady rhythm, but something was starting to change for Javier. He didn't want to admit it, but Isabel's presence was affecting him in ways he couldn't understand. However, continuing to resist the change didn't seem like an option. Circumstances were forcing him to interact with her more, and it made him uneasy. Javier had the habit of arriving at the school and hiding behind his tasks, avoiding talking to Isabel or anyone else as much as possible. But over time, it seemed like fate was conspiring to put them together in situations he couldn't ignore. One morning, the school principal called him in for a new assignment. He would have to help Isabel organize an event for the children. "Javier," said the principal, with the authoritative tone he knew all too well, "we need your help next week for the children's art fair. You'll be working alongside Isabel. He bit his lip, clearly irritated. Are you sure you need me for this? I'm just the guy who cleans the floors. The principal frowned. Yes, we need you. This event requires strength to carry things, and you're one of the few who can help. Plus, it'll be good for you to learn to work as a team. Teamwork was the last thing Javier wanted to do. Fine, whatever, he replied dismissively, making it clear he had no interest in the task. The principal just sighed and headed back to her office. In the days that followed, Javier and Isabel spent more time together, organizing materials for the event. They set up tents, arranged tables, and prepared activities for the kids. Javier did everything mechanically, still trying to keep his distance. But there was something about the way Isabel spoke to him, without judgment, without forcing anything, that started to bother him less. While adjusting the tarp on one of the tents, Isabel tried to start a conversation again. You're good with your hands, she remarked, watching as he tied the ropes with precision. Have you done this before? Javier shrugged, trying not to engage. My dad was a carpenter. I guess I picked up a few things watching him work. Ah, that makes sense, she replied casually, as if commenting on the weather. You've got a knack for it. He didn't like talking about his father, but Isabel didn't ask any more questions about it. There was no pity in her voice, which was something Javier was beginning to notice as different. He was used to people looking at him with either sympathy or judgment, but Isabel seemed to accept what he said and let the subject flow naturally. During the preparations, one of the younger kids, a girl named Clara, approached Javier, tugging at his shirt. Uncle, can you help me draw something? The girl asked, holding a piece of paper and some colored pencils. Javier, not used to interacting directly with the children, looked over at Isabel for some explanation or help. Isabel just smiled. Why not help her? You can draw anything. The important thing is to have fun, she encouraged him. He rolled his eyes but took the pencil from the girl's hand and sat down next to her, not really knowing what he was doing. All right, what do you want me to draw? A bird, Clara answered excitedly. Javier sketched a simple bird and handed the paper back to the girl, who grinned from ear to ear. Thank you, Uncle. She ran off to show the drawing to her friends. Isabel watched from afar, a light smile on her face. Javier, for his part, was clearly uncomfortable, but for the first time he didn't seem entirely irritated by the situation. This was new for him. He'd never been one to interact with kids, but there was something innocent about Clara and the other children that, for a moment, made him forget his frustrations. Even though he still carried that emotional armor, the simple act of drawing for the girl opened a small crack in it. At the end of the day, while Javier was storing the last of the boxes in the storage room, Isabel appeared again. You did well with Clara today, she commented casually. The kids like you. I'm not here for that, Javier replied, trying to maintain his usual tone but with less conviction than before. Isabel smiled. I know. But somehow, you end up helping more than you realize. He didn't respond, just shut the storage room door and walked off without saying another word. There was something unsettling about the way Isabel made everything seem so simple. It was as if she saw something in him that he didn't see himself, and that made him uncomfortable. Javier was used to being treated as the problem, the troubled kid no one wanted around. But Isabel didn't seem to think that way, and it disarmed him a little more each day. In the days leading up to the art fair, Javier was forced to spend more time with Isabel than he had ever imagined. At first, he continued to do things out of obligation, but over time, his initial resistance slowly began to fade. He still kept his distance, but he started responding more when Isabel spoke to him, even asking small questions in return, something he had never done before. One day, during the final preparations for the event, Isabel did something that caught him by surprise. While they were hanging the last decorations, she approached him and, in her calm voice, asked a question Javier didn't expect. Have you ever thought about leaving Villa del Valle? Isabel asked, not taking her eyes off the colorful banners she was hanging. The question hit Javier like a shock. He had spent most of his life dreaming of escaping, but this was the first time someone had asked him directly. He looked at Isabel, who was now looking back at him, curious. I think about it all the time, he replied without much thought. This place isn't for me. Isabel smiled, but there was something different in her eyes this time, a kind of understanding Javier couldn't quite interpret. Sometimes we think running away is the only solution, but often the answers are closer than we think. He didn't know how to respond to that. Running away had always seemed like the only way, but for some reason, Isabel's words lingered in his mind. She unsettled him, not with judgment, but with a calm acceptance he had never experienced. She spoke to him as if she truly believed there was something in him worth saving. Javier now found himself at a point of no return. He didn't want to care, but he could no longer completely ignore it. He was being drawn into a journey he had resisted with all his might until now. The day of the school's art fair arrived faster than Javier had expected. The weeks of preparation had been exhausting, but everything seemed to be in place. The children ran excitedly through the tents, showing off their drawings, while the parents watched from afar. Isabel was busy, helping organize the activities and making sure everything ran smoothly. Javier, meanwhile, did what was asked of him, still with the same indifferent attitude, but something about his posture was starting to change. He was now paying more attention to what was happening around him, though he still tried to maintain a facade of disinterest. He couldn't deny that in some way there was something satisfying about watching the children have fun, running around with smiles on their faces. Clara, the girl he had helped draw the bird, approached him once again, tugging at the hem of his shirt. "Uncle, come see what I drew," she said, holding up a piece of paper with a new, colorful drawing. Javier glanced at the drawing without much enthusiasm, but for the first time a small, restrained smile crept across his face. "Looks good," he replied, trying not to show too much involvement, but Clara seemed satisfied. "You helped me," she said before running off to show the drawing to another child. Javier watched the scene from a distance, still unsure how to process what he was feeling. Part of him remained resistant, trying to keep up the same indifference as always. But another part was beginning to question what he truly wanted. It was strange to realize that, amidst the chaos of his life, that small gesture of help had made some sort of impact. However, that lightness would soon be interrupted. In the middle of the afternoon, while the event was in full swing, Luis showed up at the fair. Javier hadn't seen him in days, and his unexpected presence brought with it a wave of tension. Luis walked across the courtyard with his usual defiant swagger, his eyes scanning the crowd for Javier. When he finally spotted him, he got straight to the point. "Hey, Javier," Luis called out, with a half-smile that carried no good intentions. "You gonna stay here with these kids, or are you coming with me? We've got more important things to do." Javier hesitated. Part of him wanted to go back to his old life, to follow Luis and dive back into the rebellion he knew so well. But now, surrounded by this new environment, the children, Isabel, and the feeling that something was changing, he felt a strange disconnection. What once felt familiar now seemed out of place. Luis stepped closer, noticing Javier's hesitation. "What's up? Now you're the good guy who stays at school helping little kids. Come on. There's something better waiting outside." Isabel, who was on the other side of the courtyard, noticed the interaction from afar and slowly approached, sensing something was wrong. Javier looked at Luis, then at Isabel, feeling a growing pressure within him. He knew this was a turning point. Following Luis would mean returning to the same spiral of destruction as before, but refusing would be a drastic break from the path he had always followed. Luis insisted, now with a more serious expression. "Are you really gonna stay here? You think this is gonna change anything? In the end, you're always gonna be the same, Javier. None of this is gonna make a difference." Javier felt the weight of those words. For a moment he believed Luis might be right. Maybe nothing had really changed, and this whole connection with Isabel and the kids was just a temporary distraction. But then his eyes met Isabel's, who was silently watching the scene. There was something in her gaze, a quiet understanding, that made Javier hesitate again. "I can't go now," Javier finally responded, his voice low but firm. Luis let out a dry, incredulous laugh. "You're kidding, right? You're gonna tell me you've become one of them? One of those idiots who settle for this mediocre life?" Javier swallowed hard, feeling the tension rise within him. He wanted to reply, to defend his choice, but the words wouldn't come. Part of his mind told him Luis was right, that he didn't belong in this world. But another part, a part he didn't fully understand yet, knew that if he followed Luis, he'd be throwing away something that was just starting to grow inside him, a hope he had never allowed himself to feel. Isabel finally approached and calmly stood next to Javier. She didn't say anything, but her presence was enough for Luis to realize the situation was shifting. He took a step back, shaking his head in disapproval. "Fine, do whatever you want, but don't forget who you are, Javier. In the end, you'll always be the same." With that, Luis turned and walked away, leaving Javier standing there in silence next to Isabel. The courtyard now seemed quieter, though the sound of children still filled the air. Javier felt a tightness in his chest. He knew something important had just happened, but he didn't yet know how to deal with it. He had just refused Luis, something he never thought he'd do. "You did what you thought was right," Isabel said after a long silence, looking directly at him. Javier looked back at her, confused and frustrated. What if he's right? What if I can't change? "I'm not like you, Isabel. I'm different." Isabel smiled softly. "We're all different, Javier. But that doesn't mean you can't make different choices than you used to. He didn't respond immediately. In his mind, Luis's words still echoed. For years, he had believed his life was defined by anger, by abandonment. He had convinced himself that he had no other option but to follow that path. But now, in front of Isabel in this new reality, he was starting to wonder if he was really doomed to always be the same. I don't know if I can, Javier finally murmured, admitting what had been tormenting him. Isabel placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, her kindness making him feel both comforted and uneasy at the same time. No one really knows, Javier, but you have to try. That's what matters. Javier sighed, still torn between what he felt and what he wanted to believe. He was now standing before his first major obstacle. Refusing Luis had been the first step, but he knew the road ahead would be long and full of challenges. Yet for the first time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that maybe he could choose a different path. As the event continued around him, Javier remained there in silence, next to Isabel. For the first time, he didn't feel completely alone. The days following the art fair passed with an unusual calm in Villa del Valle. After confronting Luis and rejecting the path he had always followed, Javier now felt torn between the world he knew and this new environment that was slowly breaking through his defenses. The fair had been a success, and Javier and Isabel's work organizing it had left everyone satisfied, except Javier himself, who now found himself lost in confusing thoughts about who he really was. He spent more time at the school, helping with daily tasks and dealing with the kids. Clara, the girl he had helped draw, followed him whenever she could, pulling him into play or new drawing activities. Although Javier continued to keep up his emotional barrier, he couldn't completely ignore the innocent joy those children brought to the space. Slowly, he began to respond with less coldness, not even realizing that despite his reluctance, he was starting to open up. Isabel remained a constant presence but didn't force any deep conversations. She seemed to understand that Javier was still processing everything that had happened, and her patience was something Javier was beginning to value, though he didn't know how to express it. One day, while helping clean the courtyard after an activity with the kids, Isabel approached him, holding out a water bottle and offering it to Javier. "You've been working hard lately," she said, handing him the bottle with a calm smile. Javier took the bottle, quickly drinking a sip and handing it back without saying much. "Just doing what I'm told." "It doesn't seem like you're here just out of obligation anymore," Isabel observed, watching him with curiosity. Javier shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "I'm still serving my sentence." Isabel chuckled softly but didn't say anything for a moment. They continued cleaning the courtyard in silence until she decided to bring up something that had been on her mind for a while. "I've noticed you're good with the kids," she began casually, as she rearranged some chairs. "You've got patience even if you pretend you don't care." Javier looked at her with a mix of surprise and discomfort. "I'm not the kind of person who should be around kids." Isabel looked up, giving him her full attention. "Why do you think that?" He sighed, putting down the broom for a moment. "Because I'm complicated, Isabel. I've messed up a lot, and these kids deserve better." Isabel watched him for a while, sensing the internal battle he was fighting. "We're all complicated in some way, Javier. Nobody's perfect, but that doesn't mean you don't have something good to offer." He furrowed his brow, still skeptical of her word. It was hard for Javier to believe he could be seen as anything other than someone with problems, but there was something comforting about hearing this from Isabel, someone who seemed to truly believe what she was saying. "I think you're exaggerating," he murmured, trying to end the conversation. But Isabel just gave a calm smile and went back to arranging the chairs, letting the silence stretch between them. In the following days, Javier began to realize that he wasn't as alone as he had thought. Isabel wasn't his only source of support. The children at school, like Clara and others, seemed to genuinely like him, and that was something new. The connection he was forming, even reluctantly, was starting to affect him in subtle ways. One day, upon arriving at school, Javier found Mercedes, his mother, waiting for him. It was rare for her to come there, and the serious look on her face indicated there was something important to discuss. "Javier, I need to talk to you," she said, while he was still holding the gate door. Javier was surprised. Mercedes rarely got involved in his life lately, and that made him a little nervous. "What is it?" Mercedes sighed, seeming to hesitate before continuing. "I've been talking to the school principal. She told me you've been doing a good job. Different from before." Javier crossed his arms, not knowing how to react. "Okay, so what?" She watched him for a moment, her gaze tired, but there was something different in her voice. "I know things haven't been easy between us since your father left. I didn't know how to handle it, and I think I ended up distancing myself from you more than I should have." The silence that followed was heavy, and Javier didn't know what to say. He had never imagined he would hear his mother admit something like that. She had always been distant, almost indifferent, and now she was there, trying to open up, which left him confused and a little uncomfortable. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked, with a more defensive tone than he intended. Mercedes lowered her head for a moment before responding. "Because I'm seeing that you're changing, Javier, and I don't want to miss the chance to try to fix things between us." Javier didn't know how to process that. He had spent so much time harboring anger and resentment that the idea of his mother wanting to repair their relationship seemed distant and almost unbelievable. He stayed silent for a few moments, avoiding Mercedes' gaze, but Isabel's words echoed in his mind. Maybe he really was changing, even if he didn't want to admit it. I don't know if I can," he said, almost in a whisper, looking at the ground. Mercedes stepped forward and hesitantly touched his arm. "Nobody knows if they can, Javier, but I'm here if you want to try." Javier didn't respond immediately, just nodded slightly, without looking directly at his mother. It was a first step, though uncertain, but the door to a possible reconciliation had been opened. Over time, his interactions with his mother and Isabel's continued support began to soften some of the walls Javier had built. He was still reluctant to fully trust the people around him, but little by little, he was accepting that he didn't have to face the world alone. The children at school saw him as someone important. His mother was trying to reconnect, and Isabel, with her infinite patience, continued to be a constant figure of support. Javier was changing, even if he couldn't clearly see it. He still had a long road ahead, full of challenges and inner conflicts, but for the first time in a long time, he felt that maybe there was a chance for something different. He wasn't alone, and that was the first step toward realizing there were other ways to live, beyond anger and pain. The days in Villa del Valle dragged on at a slow and steady pace, but for Javier, each one felt like a new test. Although there were moments when he felt part of that new world, with children running around the school and Isabel by his side, always calm and present, a dark cloud hovered over his mind. Every time he believed he was making progress, something inside him pulled him back, like an invisible current. The fear of failing, of being the same Javier he had always known, continued to haunt him. One particularly sweltering afternoon, while helping organize toys in the schoolyard, Javier noticed Isabel sitting on one of the nearby benches, holding her hands against her forehead. Her face was slightly pale, and for a moment she seemed distant, as if focused on something Javier couldn't see. He hesitated to ask what was wrong, but concern quickly turned into discomfort. Isabel was the person who always seemed to have everything under control. Seeing any sign of fragility in her made him Isabel noticed Javier's gaze and, realizing that he was watching her, straightened up on the bench and gave him a smile. But something was different. It wasn't the warm, energetic smile she usually had. It was more forced, as if she was using her willpower to maintain the calm appearance. "Is everything okay?" Javier asked, trying not to sound too worried, but unable to fully hide his curiosity. Isabel nodded without changing her expression. "Yes, just a bit of a headache. It'll pass soon." He frowned, feeling that there was more behind her words, but didn't press the issue. She had always been reserved about herself, and Javier, though curious, respected that boundary. He went back to his work, but couldn't shake the image of Isabel in that moment, sitting alone, battling something he couldn't understand. The nights for Javier were even lonelier. He would spend hours awake, lying in bed, reliving the events of the day. In one of those moments of insomnia, his mind began to spiral into an endless loop of doubts. No matter how much he was trying, something inside him kept telling him he wasn't enough, that sooner or later he would go back to being the problematic boy everyone knew. He remembered when Luis confronted him during the art fair. What Luis said still echoed in his mind. "You'll always be the same, Javier. None of this will make a difference." What if he was right? What if, deep down, all attempts to change were in vain? Javier couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how hard he tried, fate would drag him back to the same place as always. One afternoon, days later, Javier was helping prepare a new activity for the children when suddenly a wave of frustration surged through him. Everything he did seemed to have some sort of expiration date. How much longer would the people around him believe he could change? How much longer would Isabel be patient with him? And his mother. Javier couldn't see a future where all of this was permanent. He had the feeling that everything happening around him was temporary, about to fall apart. Isabel, who was beside him organizing materials, noticed the tension in Javier. She stopped what she was doing and looked at him with the same calm as always. But this time, there was something different in her posture. She seemed slightly more tired than usual, as if the energy that always accompanied her was slowly being drained. "You seem tense," she said in a low voice, without taking her eyes off him. Javier hesitated, fighting the urge to say everything was fine. I'm trying, but I don't know if it's enough. It feels like no matter what I do, there will always be a part of me that will ruin everything. Isabel stepped a little closer, but as she did, he noticed a slight tremor in her hands as she arranged the materials. For a second, Javier wondered if it was fatigue or something else, but she quickly crossed her arms, hiding the movement, and kept her gaze steady on him. No one expects you to be perfect, Javier, and you don't have to be, she said, with a faint smile that seemed tired. What matters is that you're trying. That's more than many people do. Javier let out a heavy sigh. I just don't know how much longer I can keep this up. It seems like everyone thinks I can change, but what if I can't? Isabel tilted her head, as if pondering the answer. There was kindness in her voice, but also a fatigue she was trying to hide. I think we're all afraid of not being what others expect. But in the end, what really matters is who you want to be, not what others expect from you. He thought about that, but the doubt still hadn't left him. Javier had always been afraid to care. For him, deep connections brought with them the risk of pain and abandonment, something he knew all too well. And even now, with people around him who seemed to genuinely care for him, the fear of disappointing them was unbearable. But there was something else bothering him in that moment. Isabel. She continued to be his main support, but he was starting to notice small changes. The smile that used to come easily now seemed less spontaneous, as if she were trying harder than usual. And that moment in the yard when she was sitting alone with a headache still echoed in his mind. He felt that something wasn't right. But as always, Isabel kept her walls up when it came to herself. Later that same day, after the children had left, Javier was in the storage room putting away some materials when Isabel entered the room, a little slower than usual. She seemed slightly out of breath, but quickly masked it, giving him a smile. You've been very helpful lately, she commented, trying to keep the tone light. You look tired, Javier replied bluntly, watching her closely. Isabel laughed softly, but the sound was different, almost forced. I'm fine, just a busy day. He looked at her for a few more seconds, trying to figure out what was really going on. But as always, Isabel gave no room for further questions. It was as if she knew exactly how to deflect any focus away from herself. If you need anything, just say the word, he said, in a rare moment of vulnerability, not entirely sure where the words had come from. Isabel smiled again, this time more genuinely. Thank you, Javier. As she left the room, he stood there for a while, processing what had just happened. Isabel had always been there for him, always ready to listen, always present. But something was wrong, something she wasn't revealing. And for the first time, Javier wondered if he'd ever get the chance to repay the support she'd given him. The self-doubt that had been haunting him continued to gnaw at him. The constant fear that he could lose everything at any moment, his mother, Isabel, the children, was ever present. But now, a new concern emerged. Isabel. Something was going on, and for the first time, he realized that maybe he wasn't the only one who needed help. Time seemed to slow down. The vibrant colors of the drawings the children were holding blurred into the background, as Javier's focus narrowed on Isabel, now collapsed on the floor. The laughter and chatter filling the room were replaced by a heavy, almost tangible silence, broken only by the sound of Javier's heartbeat pounding in his ears. Isabel, Isabel, he gently shook her shoulder, unsure if he should be more careful or more insistent. She didn't respond right away, and panic surged within him like a massive wave threatening to swallow him whole. He looked around for help and saw the children frozen in shock, some starting to cry. Javier's instinct was to call for someone, anyone, but his feet felt rooted to the ground. The thought that Isabel might be seriously ill, or worse, was simply too much to process at that moment. Someone. Help! He finally yelled, his voice echoing through the room, though he wasn't sure what exactly he needed to do. After what felt like an eternity, Isabel began to stir, opening her eyes slowly. Her face was pale, and there was a deep exhaustion etched into her expression, as if just waking up took all her strength. She blinked a few times, trying to orient herself, while Javier still knelt beside her, unsure of what to say or do. Isabel, he whispered, his voice trembling. What happened? She tried to smile, but it was weak, almost non-existent. I just got a little dizzy. It's nothing, she murmured, as if trying to convince both herself and him. Javier shook his head, incredulous. Nothing? You passed out. It can't just be exhaustion. Isabel took a deep breath, as if she needed to gather her strength to continue the conversation. Javier, I'm fine, really. I've just been feeling a little weak lately. He stood up quickly, offering his hand to help her, but she hesitated for a second before accepting. When she finally stood, Javier noticed that Isabel was leaning on his shoulders more than he expected. She was clearly weaker than she was letting on. What are you hiding from me? he asked, his voice full of concern and frustration. Until that moment, Javier had been wrestling with his own demons. But now he realized that Isabel was fighting a battle he hadn't even imagined. Isabel looked away, as if she didn't know how to respond. Her eyes reflected a mix of guilt and resistance. And for the first time, Javier saw that there was much more behind her calm smile and peaceful demeanor. He didn't know what it was, but something inside him screamed that Isabel wasn't being honest about her health. Javier had always been used to dealing with his own pain alone, but seeing Isabel hide hers made his chest tighten in a way he couldn't explain. She tried to change the subject, avoiding his eyes. "Let's take care of the kids. They're scared." Javier glanced around, realizing the children were watching them from a distance, many of them crying silently. Clara, with tears in her eyes, was among the first to approach. "Isabel, are you okay?" the girl asked, her voice full of concern. Isabel crouched down with effort and smiled gently at Clara, placing her hand on the girl's head. "Yes, Clara, it was just a scare, nothing more." While Isabel's smile calmed the children, it didn't have the same effect on Javier. Something inside him had changed in that moment. He didn't know how or why, but seeing Isabel so vulnerable had broken something inside him. For weeks, Javier had been fighting his own insecurities, wondering if he was worthy of change, if he had the strength to leave behind the troubled boy he had always been. But now, faced with Isabel's fragility, his own issues seemed small. For the first time, he realized that Isabel was hiding something serious. And though he didn't know exactly what it was, he knew she didn't want anyone to see her as fragile, as someone in need of help. This made him reflect on himself, on how he too avoided being seen as vulnerable. Isabel had supported him, helped him face his fears, but who was there to help her? As he helped the children settle back into their routines, Javier couldn't shake the growing feeling that now he needed to be stronger, not for himself, but for Isabel. The thought that she was dealing with something far bigger than he knew began to consume his thoughts. The fear that he could lose the one person who saw beyond his anger and pain started to grip him. The silence after Isabel's faint seemed endless. Even though she had recovered and insisted she was fine, something had shifted in Javier. He knew, with an unsettling certainty, that Isabel was hiding something more serious than just exhaustion. The way she avoided his gaze, dodging questions, confirmed what he feared. In the days that followed, life at the school went on, but the lightness that had once existed in Isabel seemed to have vanished. Javier watched her more closely now, noticing small signs that had previously gone unnoticed. The way she discreetly rubbed her forehead, how she sometimes paused for a few seconds, breathing deeply, trying to hide her discomfort. Yet, despite his desire to confront her directly, something held him back. Maybe it was the fear of the truth. That night, as Javier walked alone through the streets of Villa del Valle, he felt the weight of his emotions overwhelming his mind. He thought about Isabel, about how strong she had always been, how she had always been there for him, even when he refused to accept help. And now he was beginning to realize that maybe it was his turn to be the support she needed, even if she wouldn't admit it. Mercedes, his mother, was at home when he arrived. She looked at him with a mix of surprise and curiosity. Javier had spent the last few days lost in his own thoughts, distant, but clearly troubled. "Javier, what's going on? You seem tense lately," she asked as she prepared a cup of tea in the kitchen. Javier remained silent for a moment, thinking about how he could talk about it. He had never been open with his mother, but now, with everything that was happening, he felt a need to share, even if just a little. "It's Isabel," he finally said, not taking his eyes off the floor. Mercedes stopped what she was doing and looked at him, curious. "What about her?" Javier took a deep breath, struggling to put into words what he had been feeling. "She passed out at the school. She says she's fine, but something's wrong. I know it." Mercedes approached slowly and placed a gentle hand on her son's shoulder. "Sometimes people hide what they're going through because they don't want to worry others, Javier." He shook his head, the frustration starting to spill over. "But I care, and I don't know what to do." Mercedes was silent for a moment, absorbing his words. Javier had never spoken like this before, had never shown so much concern for someone else. She realized how much Isabel must mean to him. Maybe it's time to ask her directly. "You deserve to know, and she needs to understand that she's not alone," Mercedes said with a calm wisdom that Javier didn't expect. The next day, determined to find out the truth, Javier went to the school. He wasn't sure exactly how he would start the conversation, but he knew he couldn't ignore what was happening any longer. When he arrived, he found Isabel sitting alone on a bench in the courtyard, looking up at the sky. There was something melancholic in her posture, and for the first time, Javier realized how small, fragile, and almost lost she seemed. He approached slowly, trying to find the right words. "Isabel, I need to talk to you. She turned around, giving him that familiar smile, but there was a sadness in her eyes he had never seen before. What is it, Javier? He hesitated for a moment, then sat down next to her. I know you're not okay. There's no point in hiding it anymore. I'm worried about you, and I think you need to tell me what's going on. Isabel looked away, taking a deep breath as if she were gathering the strength for a conversation she'd been avoiding for a long time. She was silent for a few seconds, and Javier could see she was struggling within herself, deciding whether or not to tell him the truth. I didn't want you to worry, she began, her voice low and restrained. I've always been the one helping others, you know? And it's hard to admit that this time I'm the one who needs help. Javier felt his chest tighten. He knew what was coming wouldn't be easy. A few months ago, I was diagnosed with leukemia, she finally said, her voice faltering slightly as she spoke the word. That's why I've been feeling this way, why I fainted. I'm in treatment, but it's not working as well as I'd hoped. The words hit Javier like a punch. He froze, trying to process what he had just heard. Leukemia. He didn't know much about the disease, but he knew enough to understand it was serious, something that could change everything. The silence that followed was heavy, as Javier tried to find something, anything, to say. Why didn't you tell me sooner? He finally asked, his voice thick with emotion. Isabel looked at him, her eyes filled with a sadness he had never seen. Because I didn't want to be treated like I'm sick. I didn't want people to look at me and see only that. And besides, I wanted you to see me as a friend, not as someone who needs help all the time. Javier shook his head, feeling a mix of anger, sadness, and desperation. But you're more than that, Isabel. You always have been, and I want to be here for you. I need to be. She smiled softly, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. I know, and that's why I'm telling you now, because I trust you. Javier felt tears start to form, but he fought them back. He couldn't fall apart now, not when Isabel needed him. But the weight of her revelation left him breathless, like the ground was disintegrating beneath his feet. The idea of losing Isabel was something he simply couldn't bear. We'll get through this together, he said, his voice firm, trying to keep his emotions in check. You're not going to face this alone. Isabel looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time, the barrier she had always maintained began to crumble. The tears she had been holding back finally fell, silently, as she nodded. I hope you're right, she whispered. Javier took her hand, and for the first time, he felt that his own pain, his own struggles, didn't matter as much as they once had. Isabel needed him now, and he knew he would do anything to stand by her, even if the road ahead was difficult and uncertain. The days that followed Isabel's revelation blurred together in Javier's mind. He tried to carry on as usual, going to school, helping the kids, but everything seemed to have lost its brightness. Knowing that Isabel was battling something as serious as leukemia cast a shadow over every moment they spent together. Each of her smiles now seemed tinged with sadness, and the fragility she tried to hide became more apparent with each passing day. Isabel, however, continued to try to live lightly. Even with the weight of the illness and the difficult treatment she was undergoing, she insisted on not letting it define her life. She came to school every day, participated in activities with the kids, and kept her smile, though Javier now noticed more than ever how that smile sometimes seemed forced. One afternoon, while they were organizing supplies for an art workshop, Javier noticed Isabel looked more tired than usual. She had dark circles under her eyes, and her hands trembled slightly as she held the brushes. You should be resting, Javier said, unable to hide the concern in his voice. He was always watching, waiting for any sign she was getting worse. I don't want to spend my days in bed, Isabel replied softly. I want to spend the time I have doing the things that make me happy. Those words were like knives to Javier. Every time Isabel talked about the time she had, he felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He didn't want to think about a life without her. The idea that Isabel's time might be running out terrified him more than anything. The tension between them grew each day. Javier wanted to do more, wanted to protect her somehow, but he knew her battle was internal, and all he could do was be there. Yet, it didn't seem like enough. He felt helpless. A few days later, while helping the kids with a group activity, Isabel suddenly dropped the brush she was holding and brought her hand to her chest. Javier was across the room, but he immediately sensed something was wrong. He dropped what he was doing and rushed over to her. Isabel, are you okay? He asked, his voice filled with urgency. She tried to smile, but this time couldn't hide the pain on her face. I just need a minute, she whispered, struggling to catch her breath. Javier helped her sit on a nearby bench, and the children, sensing something was wrong, watched in worried silence. Desperation welled up inside Javier. He didn't know what to do, and it was tearing him apart. He knew Isabel was getting weaker, but seeing her so vulnerable made him feel a kind of anguish he had never experienced before. You need to go to the doctor, he said, his voice firm, trying to control his panic. Now, Isabel shook her head, trying to pull herself together. No, it'll pass. I just need to rest a little. But Javier wasn't convinced. He couldn't stand by anymore, watching Isabel fight something so huge without doing anything. Please, Isabel, he pleaded, his eyes begging her. You can't keep going like this. I know you want to be strong, but you need help. Isabel looked at him, and for a moment her eyes filled with tears. She had always been the one helping others, the one who kept everything under control. But now, in front of Javier, she allowed herself to be vulnerable, even if just for a few seconds. I know, she whispered, her voice breaking. But I'm so scared, Javier. That confession shattered Javier's heart. He never imagined he'd hear Isabel, the strongest person he knew, admit that she was afraid. And it made him realize just how much she had been fighting alone, even with him by her side. Javier squeezed her hand, trying to give her some strength. I'm here, he said, with a firmness he didn't know he had. No matter what happens, I'm not leaving your side. Isabel smiled faintly, but the exhaustion in her eyes was undeniable. I know you are, and that helps more than you can imagine. After that episode, Javier convinced Isabel to return to the hospital for a checkup. The test results weren't good, the treatment wasn't having the expected effect, and the doctors decided to try a more aggressive approach. Javier stayed by her side throughout the appointment, listening to every word the doctor said, even though they seemed surreal. Leukemia, intensive treatment, possible complications. Each of these words echoed in Javier's mind as he tried to keep it together and not break. When they left the hospital, Isabel looked more worn out than ever. The drive back to Villa del Valle was silent. Javier was at the wheel, but his mind was racing. He knew Isabel was trying to be strong, but he could see the disease was gaining ground. The fear of losing her consumed him more each day. The following weeks were tough. Isabel started a new, more intense treatment cycle, which meant she was absent from school more often. When she could come, she forced herself to smile, but Javier could see she was growing weaker. The sparkle in her eyes, which had always been her trademark, seemed to be fading little by little. Javier, on the other hand, felt increasingly helpless. He wanted to do more, somehow heal her, but he knew that was beyond his control. The only thing he could do was be there, by her side, supporting her every step of the way. But that didn't lessen the fear growing inside him. One night, after another difficult day, Javier was at home, sitting at the kitchen table, when Mercedes walked in. She watched him for a few moments, seeing the son who had once been rebellious, now consumed by worry for someone he clearly loved. You're taking very good care of her, Javier, Mercedes said softly. Javier looked at his mother, surprised by her comment but unable to smile. I'm trying, but sometimes it feels like it's not enough. Mercedes moved closer and sat beside him. Sometimes just being there is more than enough. Javier lowered his head, feeling the weight of his emotion. He wasn't sure if he'd be strong enough for what was coming. Isabel was fighting with all her strength, but deep down, he knew time was running out, and that terrified him. The days passed like a heavy fog in Javier's life. Every morning, he woke up with the same weight on his chest, knowing Isabel was deteriorating. She kept fighting, doing her best to maintain her routine, but her body was no longer keeping up with her spirit. Javier tried to be there, doing everything he could to support her. But deep inside, he knew the situation was becoming more and more unsustainable. The more aggressive treatments began to take their toll. Isabel, once full of life and energy, now spent most of her time lying down, weakened by the side effects. Her smiles became rarer, and her visits to the school she loved so much became sporadic. When she could go, she made a tremendous effort to seem okay. But Javier, who knew her deeply, could see the exhaustion and pain in her eyes. One late afternoon, after another treatment session, Javier and Isabel returned home in silence. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, but both knew something was about to change. Javier felt Isabel slipping away, as if she were preparing for a quiet goodbye. The thought filled him with despair, but he didn't know how to handle it. The fear of losing her was overwhelming, but at the same time, he refused to accept reality. You've been amazing, you know, Isabel said, breaking the silence as she looked out the car window. Her voice was soft, almost fragile, as if every word required effort. Javier, his eyes fixed on the road, gripped the steering wheel tighter. Don't say that like it's the end, Isabel. It's not over yet. She sighed gently, still gazing at the passing landscape. I know you want to believe that, and I do too. But sometimes life doesn't give us all the choices. Those words hit Javier like a punch. The resignation in her voice made him realize that deep down, Isabel was preparing for the worst. He refused to accept it, but she seemed more aware of her own mortality than he could bear, and that left him feeling powerless. In the following weeks, Isabel grew even weaker. Hospital visits became more frequent, and going to school, once the happiest part of her day, turned into a painful sacrifice. One morning, Javier visited her at home after another difficult night. When he entered the room, he saw Isabel lying in bed, pale, her eyes tired, her small frame barely visible under the blankets. Her smile when she saw him was genuine, but it no longer had the brightness it once did. He sat beside her, and an uncomfortable silence settled between them. "I wish things were different," Javier said, his voice low, full of repressed emotion. He knew they didn't have much time left, and he hated that truth. Isabel looked at him tenderly, placing her frail hand over his. "You made things different, Javier. You changed. You showed me that there were still good things to live for, despite everything." He felt the tears start to burn in his eyes, but tried to hold them back. "I just wish I had more time with you." She gave him a sad smile. "Me too." At that moment, Javier realized there was nothing more to say. Words seemed insignificant in the face of what was happening. He wanted to fight, but against what? Against the cruel reality that was slowly taking Isabel from his life? Against the pain consuming them both? Days later, Javier was urgently called to the hospital. Isabel's condition had worsened suddenly. When he arrived, his heart was pounding so hard he could barely think. He ran through the corridors, his mind numb with the fear of what was coming. When he entered the room, he found Isabel surrounded by machines, her breathing weak and irregular. Father Mateo, Isabel's father, was beside her in silence, his hands clasped in a quiet prayer. He looked at Javier with a mix of pain and acceptance. In that moment, it felt as if time had stopped. Javier approached, sitting beside Isabel. He held her hand, colder and more fragile than he had ever felt. She slowly opened her eyes, and for a moment, they met. There was a deep exhaustion there, but also a quiet peace. "I knew you'd come," Isabel whispered, her voice barely audible. Javier felt the tears finally fall, streaming down his face uncontrollably. "I'll always be here." She tried to smile, but was too weak. "You gave me more than I expected, more than I could have asked for. Thank you for making me smile again." "No," Javier said, his voice choked. "You gave me everything, Isabel. You showed me I could be a better person. You gave me hope." Isabel closed her eyes for a moment, her breath shallow and labored. "I know, and you'll keep being that person, even when I'm not here." Javier shook his head, the tears falling in torrents. "Don't say that. You'll be fine. You have to be." She gently squeezed his hand with what little strength she had left. "Everything will be okay, Javier. I promise." And with those final words, Isabel closed her eyes for the last time. Javier felt the world crumble around him. The sound of the hospital monitors became a distant echo as he held Isabel's now lifeless hand. The room felt small, suffocating, and the pain that gripped his chest was indescribable. He didn't know how to endure it. Everything he had feared for so long was now real, and reality crushed him. Father Mateo, in silence, placed a hand on Javier's shoulder but said nothing. Words no longer had any meaning at that moment. Isabel was gone, and with her, part of Javier's world had gone too. The fall was devastating. The sense of loss was so intense that he didn't know how to move forward. All the efforts, all the promises, seemed to have been in vain. And now he was alone, facing the void Isabel had left, not knowing how to fill the space she occupied in his heart. Javier felt his stomach churn. He didn't want to talk about it with Luis, someone who didn't understand what he was going through, someone who didn't know Isabel like he did. "It's none of your business, Luis." Luis gave a dry laugh. "Of course not. But you know, Javier, this isn't going to end well. I know you. You're going to mess this up, man. Wake up, she's sick. You really think you can handle that?" Luis's words cut like knives. Javier wasn't sure if it was anger or fear that made him want to explode, but he abruptly stood from the bench, staring at Luis with a mix of frustration and pain. "You don't understand anything," Javier growled, his fists clenched. "You'd never understand." Luis raised his hands in surrender, still with that mocking smile on his face. "Maybe not. But if you think this is going to have a happy ending, you're kidding yourself." Javier turned his back on Luis, unable to continue the conversation. His friend's words echoed in his mind, feeding the fear he already felt. He knew Isabel's illness was real, but until that moment, he had been pushing away the thought that the end was closer than he wanted to admit. The problem was, the closer he got to Isabel, the more the possibility of losing her devastated him. Later that night, Javier went to visit Isabel at her home. As he entered, he noticed that the atmosphere was quieter than usual. There was a heaviness in the air that he couldn't yet understand. Father Mateo, Isabel's father, sat in the living room with a Bible open on his lap, and he waved at Javier with a tired smile. There was a silent exchange between them, and understanding that the situation was becoming increasingly difficult. Isabel was lying in her room, her hair short and her face paler than usual. When Javier entered, she tried to smile, but he could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "Javier," she whispered, her voice weak but still carrying the same sweetness as always. "Thank you for coming." He sat beside the bed, unsure of what to say. The silence between them was heavy with emotions he didn't know how to express. As much as he wanted to speak, the words escaped him. I was thinking today," Isabel began, breaking the silence, "about how much you've changed. When I met you, you were so distant, so full of anger, but now I see a different person. You're much stronger than you think." Javier lowered his head, feeling the pain grow in his chest. "I'm not as strong as you think, Isabel. Honestly, I don't even know how to deal with this." Isabel smiled faintly, despite her fatigue. "No one knows how to deal with pain, Javier. But you're here, and that already means a lot." He looked at her, feeling tears starting to form in his eyes. "I'm scared, Isabel. I'm scared of losing you." She didn't reply immediately, just held his hand gently. "I'm scared too," she confessed, with a sincerity that touched him deeply. "But we can't let fear control what we have right now." Javier wanted to say that it was unfair, that she didn't deserve to go through this, but the words stuck in his throat. He was trapped in a cycle of conflicting emotions, the fear of loss, the frustration with the illness, and the growing realization that his feelings for Isabel were stronger than he had ever admitted to himself. As he held her hand, he felt the weight of what was coming. He knew their time was limited, but at the same time, he didn't know how to live without her. Isabel had become the anchor in his life, someone who made him want to be better, someone who had shown him what hope was. The weeks that followed were a mix of good and bad moments. There were days when Isabel seemed a little better, giving Javier a fragile sense of hope, but soon the symptoms of her illness returned, bringing with them the cruel reality he so feared. Javier was torn between wanting to make the most of every moment and the paralyzing fear that those moments were running out. Each day, Javier's internal conflict grew. He wanted to protect Isabel, to be strong for her, but the fear ate away at him from the inside. At the same time, he didn't know how to deal with his own feelings for her. He had never allowed himself to open up to anyone, and now, with Isabel, he finally understood what it meant to truly love someone, and that scared him more than anything. Winter came early to Villa del Valle, bringing with it a cold that penetrated to the bone. For Javier, the feeling that everything was growing colder wasn't just about the weather. Isabel's illness, more present every day, was a constant reminder that he was running out of time, and the internal battle between savoring what was left and the paralyzing fear of losing her intensified. Every glance at Isabel squeezed his heart with a sorrow he didn't know how to face. The days were a mixture of good and bad moments. There were mornings when Isabel seemed to regain some of the strength and optimism that had always defined her. She'd go to school and engage in activities with the children, bringing smiles to their faces as if nothing was wrong. But those days were becoming increasingly rare. Most of the time, she lay in bed, too tired to get up, her pale face overtaking the once vivid expression she used to wear. Javier tried to be by her side at all times, but something inside him made him feel like he wasn't doing enough. He wanted to be strong for Isabel, but the truth was, he was broken inside. The thought of losing her was becoming unbearable, and each day he found himself more trapped by that fear. He felt like a prisoner of his own emotions, unable to deal with what was happening, yet incapable of distancing himself from her. He loved her. Of that he had no doubt. But loving also brought the pain of facing a reality he wasn't sure he could bear. One afternoon, after a visit to the hospital, Isabel sat with Javier in the small garden of her house. The cold wind touched their faces, but she insisted on going outside to feel the fresh air, saying she didn't want to spend another day locked in her room. They were both wrapped in blankets, watching the few remaining leaves on the trees swaying in the wind. Javier glanced at Isabel, observing her as she closed her eyes, taking in a deep breath of the chilly air. Her face was thinner, her eyes tired, but she seemed at peace despite everything. He wondered how she could face all of this with such serenity while he was falling apart inside. "You're quiet today," Isabel said, opening her eyes and turning to him. Her smile was soft, but there was undeniable fatigue in her voice. Javier, his head full of thoughts, just shook his head. "I'm just thinking." "About what?" she asked, curious. He hesitated to answer, unsure of how to express the whirlwind of emotions consuming him. I keep thinking about how unfair this all is. You don't deserve to go through this. I'd give anything for it to be different." Isabel smiled faintly, but there was no bitterness in her smile. "Life isn't always fair, Javier, but I think that's what makes the good moments so special. If everything were perfect, We'd never learn to appreciate what we have. He lowered his head, feeling the frustration rise again. I just don't know how I'm going to go on without you. The silence that followed was heavy. Isabel looked at him for a few moments, as if thinking about how to respond. Finally, she placed her hand over his, and the simple gesture brought Javier a mix of comfort and pain. You will go on, Javier, because you're stronger than you think. He shook his head, feeling the tears start to form, but fighting to keep them from falling. I'm not strong, Isabel. I'm scared all the time. Isabel looked at him with a tenderness that made Javier's heart ache even more. Being scared doesn't make you weak. In fact, being scared and going on anyway, that's what makes you strong. Javier looked at her, the tears finally escaping. He knew she was right, but the weight of the situation still felt unbearable. He wanted so much to protect her, to be the one to save her, but this was a battle he couldn't win. The helplessness consumed him. I love you, he murmured, finally letting the words that had been growing inside him out. He had never said that to anyone before, and as he spoke, he felt a mix of relief and pain, as if he were releasing something that had been trapped for a long time. Isabel smiled, and for the first time in weeks, Javier saw the old sparkle in her eyes. I know, she said, her voice soft, full of affection. And I love you too, Javier. The relief he felt at hearing those words was overwhelming, but the fear was still there, deeply rooted. Loving Isabel meant accepting that he would lose her, and that was the hardest part. Loving someone and knowing that the time with that person was limited. In the days that followed, Javier found himself reflecting on his own actions and how he had been dealing with the situation. He had always been someone who avoided emotional pain, someone who shut himself off from the world out of fear of getting hurt. But with Isabel, everything was different. He had opened up to her in a way he never thought possible, and in doing so, he realized that the love he felt for her was stronger than the fear of losing her. One evening, while talking with Mercedes, Javier spoke about his feelings for the first time. I love her, Mom, he said, his voice trembling. But I'm so scared of losing her, I don't know what to do. Mercedes, who had spent the last few months watching her son transform, looked at him with compassion. Loving someone sometimes means facing pain, but you can't let fear steal the good moments you still have together. Her words resonated deeply with Javier. He realized that by trying to avoid the pain of loss, he was also avoiding fully living the moments he still had with Isabel. It was as if, in protecting himself from suffering, he was missing out on what truly mattered. He understood that he needed to come to terms with what was to come in order to fully enjoy the present, no matter how painful the future might be. In the following weeks, Javier made a conscious effort to be more present, not just physically, but emotionally. He knew his time with Isabel was running out, but instead of letting fear consume him, he began to focus on the moments they still had. He learned to live with uncertainty, to embrace the love he felt, and to be there for her, knowing that this connection was what truly mattered. Isabel, in turn, noticed the change in Javier. He wasn't as tense anymore, not as trapped by pain. Even during difficult moments, he was present, with an open heart. They laughed together, cried together, and shared memories that Javier knew he would carry with him forever. Deep down, he began to understand what Isabel had always tried to teach him, that life, no matter how short, is made up of the moments of love and connection we share with the people who matter. And that, even amid the pain, was something worth fighting for. The winter days in Villa del Valle were cold and quiet, reflecting Javier's state of mind. His time with Isabel was running out. He knew this, and even though he had finally allowed himself to accept and live the love he felt for her, the weight of the imminent loss still haunted him. Isabel had become his anchor, the person who taught him to see beyond anger and fear. But now, harsh reality forced him to face the fact that their time together was coming to an end. It was a cloudy morning when Javier was called to the hospital. Isabel had been admitted again, and this time, her condition was critical. He knew this day would come, but no matter how much he tried to prepare, Javier's heart didn't feel ready. It felt like he was about to face the greatest challenge of his life, saying goodbye to someone he loved deeply. When he entered the hospital room, he saw Isabel lying in bed, wrapped in blankets, her fragile body almost disappearing into the white sheets. The room was silent, except for the rhythmic sound of the monitors tracking her vital signs. She looked pale, but when she saw Javier, her lips curled into a faint smile. Even in that moment, she still had the strength to smile. Javier approached slowly, as if afraid to shatter that fragile moment. He sat by the bedside and took her hand, cold and thin. "Hi," he whispered, trying to contain the pain he felt seeing her like that. "Hi," Isabel replied, her voice weak but still sweet. "I thought you wouldn't come." Javier shook his head, unable to hold back the tears forming in his eyes. "I'll always be here, Isabel. No matter what happens." She looked at him tenderly, and Javier felt a mix of sadness and gratitude. Even in her darkest moments, Isabel was still the light guiding him. "I know you will," she said with a light sigh, "and that gives me peace." For a moment they sat in silence, simply holding each other's hand. Javier didn't know how to begin expressing what he felt. There were so many things he wanted to say, so many thoughts he wanted to share with her, but words seemed insufficient to convey the depth of his emotion. He wanted to tell her that he loved her, that she had changed his life forever, but those words felt small compared to the magnitude of the loss he felt approaching. "I was thinking about us," Isabel suddenly said, breaking the silence. "I know this isn't the life we imagined, but despite everything, I'm grateful for every moment." Javier swallowed hard, feeling the pain crush his chest. "Me too, but I wish we had more time." She smiled softly, squeezing his hand. "I wish that too, but life, it's made up of these moments, you know? Even if they're brief." Javier lowered his head, fighting back the tears. "I don't know how I'm going to move on without you." Isabel looked at him with her tired eyes, still filled with a quiet strength. "You will, because you're strong, Javier, and because I'll always be with you in some way." Her words, spoken with such certainty, hit him deeply. Javier knew Isabel was right, but the thought of continuing without her was devastating. Still, there was a sense of peace in hearing those words. Isabel had changed his life in ways he never imagined, and he knew that no matter what happened, she would always be a part of who he was. "I love you, Isabel," he said, his voice faltering slightly as the tears finally streamed down his face. "I love you more than I can ever express." She smiled again, her face glowing despite her weakness. "I know, and I love you too, Javier. You were the best thing that ever happened to me." Isabel's words hung in the air, and at that moment, Javier felt his world collapse around him. He knew the end was near, and the pain of losing Isabel was stronger than anything he had ever felt. But at the same time, there was a sense of fulfillment in knowing that they had loved each other, that they had shared something true, even if for such a short time. Isabel closed her eyes and her breathing became slower, lighter. The room was engulfed in deep silence, and Javier knew that this was the moment he had dreaded. He held her hand tighter, as if somehow he could hold on to her for a little longer, as if the physical contact could delay the inevitable. Time seemed to stop. Javier watched Isabel, her face serene, and he felt a mix of pain and acceptance. He knew she was leaving, but he also knew that her fight had come to an end. Isabel was at peace. The sound of the monitors began to change, becoming slower, more spaced out. Javier felt a pressure in his chest, a suffocating pain that made him want to scream, but he remained silent, holding Isabel's hand until the last moment. And then she was gone. The room fell into absolute silence. Javier remained seated by the bed, still holding Isabel's hand, unable to move. Tears flowed silently down his face, and the emptiness that settled in his chest seemed unbearable. But deep down, he knew Isabel was at peace, and that somehow she would always be with him. That night, Javier left the hospital with a heavy heart, but also with a painful sense of relief. He had said goodbye to Isabel, but he knew that her impact on his life would never disappear. The love they shared, brief as it was, had changed Javier forever. He was no longer the boy full of anger and hatred who pushed everyone away. Isabel had taught him to love, to be vulnerable, to believe that life, despite all its pain, was still worth living. Javier walked through the streets of Villa del Valle, feeling the cold wind on his face. He thought about everything Isabel had said, about everything they had lived together. The pain of loss was immense, but for the first time in his life, Javier felt at peace with his emotions. He had learned through Isabel that true love isn't measured by time, but by the depth of the connection. And with that thought, he continued walking, knowing that even without Isabel by his side, she would always be with him, in every step he took from that day forward. Isabel's death left a deep mark on Javier. The days following the goodbye were wrapped in a haze of pain and silence. Villa del Valle seemed quieter than ever, as if the town itself was mourning the girl who had touched so many lives. But Javier felt that grief wasn't something to be shared. It was an intimate pain, something he carried within him, each step heavier than the last. Isabel's funeral was simple but beautiful, just as she would have liked. The townspeople, many of whom she had touched with her kindness and smile, attended in great numbers. The school children, whom Isabel had loved so much, held flowers and drew little cards in her honor. Javier watched everything in silence, the words stuck in his throat, unable to express the depth of what he felt. Even with all those people around, he felt alone, like a part of him had been taken along with Isabel. Father Mateo, Isabel's father, conducted the funeral with the dignity of a man who understood the meaning of loss, but also with the serenity of someone who believed his daughter was now at peace. He spoke of Isabel with pride, reminding everyone of the positive impact she had left on the community, even in her short life. Javier silently felt the words echo in his heart, but the pain was still too intense to be soothed. After the funeral, Javier stood beside Isabel's grave, watching the last people leave. The cold winter wind blew lightly, and he remained there, alone, hands in his pockets, staring at the freshly covered ground. He couldn't move. It was as if, by leaving, he would somehow be distancing himself from her, and the thought was unbearable. Luis appeared silently beside him. Javier hadn't expected to see him, but for once Luis didn't say anything provocative. He just stood there quietly with his hands in his pockets, sharing the moment with his friend. They didn't need to speak. Luis understood Javier's pain in a way that words could never convey. After a few minutes, Luis finally broke the silence. "She was special, man," he said, his voice hoarse. "And you've changed. It's obvious." Javier nodded, trying to hold back the tears that still insisted on falling. "She changed me," he replied in a low voice, almost as if speaking to himself. "She showed me what it meant to be a better person." Luis nodded, but said nothing more. He knew this kind of pain would take a long time to heal, but he also knew that Javier was no longer the same person he had been. There was something different about him, a maturity that hadn't been there before. The Javier Luis once knew, the angry, rebellious boy, had now become someone who had experienced true love, and that had changed everything. In the weeks that followed, Javier tried to find a new sense of purpose. The pain of losing Isabel was still there, but something inside him began to shift. He thought a lot about the conversations they had before her death, about her words on being strong and moving forward, even when everything seemed impossible. And little by little, Javier realized that the only way to honor what Isabel had taught him was to live life fully, in the way she would have wanted. He returned to school, this time with a new perspective. The children, who also missed Isabel, began to see Javier as an important figure. He now helped more than ever, and often found himself remembering how Isabel dealt with the kids, with patience, care, and a smile, even on tough days. Clara, the little girl who had always followed Javier around school, was one of the ones who became most attached to him after Isabel's death. "Uncle, do you think Isabel is in heaven?" Clara asked one afternoon as she drew in the classroom. Javier smiled, remembering Isabel's words about faith and love. "Yes, Clara, I think she's in heaven, and she's very proud of all of us." Clara smiled, as if Javier's answer comforted her, and returned to her drawing, at peace. The presence of the children brought a kind of healing to Javier. They reminded him of Isabel, but in a light-hearted way, as if her spirit was still there in those small moments of joy. Javier began reconnecting with his mother, Mercedes, in a way he never had before. She, who had been so distant during his teenage years, now tried to be a support for him. Mercedes knew that grief was a long process, but seeing her son transform, she also felt that there was a new opportunity for closeness between them. Javier was no longer the rebellious young man he once was. He had matured, and this new phase brought with it a chance for a fresh start for both of them. A few weeks later, Javier returned to the spot where he and Isabel used to meet to talk, the town's central square, under the big tree that stood in the middle. The spring sun was beginning to shine again, and the fresh air carried the scent of flowers starting to bloom. He sat on the bench where they had often talked, and for a moment he closed his eyes, letting the sun warm his face. He knew that the time he had with Isabel had been short, but the intensity of the love he felt for her could never be measured in years. Every moment with her had been a lesson, an opportunity to rediscover himself, to learn to love and accept love, even when it was painful. Javier understood that Isabel's presence had been a gift he would carry with him for the rest of his life. As he sat there, he smiled, remembering her last words, about how life was made up of small moments of love. She had taught him to be more human, more vulnerable, and not to fear surrendering to what was real. The transformation she had brought about in him was visible in everything he did now. Javier opened his eyes, looked up at the sky, and took a deep breath. He knew that grief would stay with him for a long time, but for the first time, he felt ready to move forward, carrying with him Isabel's legacy, the love she had taught him, and the strength he had discovered within himself. Time passed in Villa del Valle, and with it, the seasons changed. Spring arrived, bringing flowers and colors back to the small town. For Javier, each new day was a mix of longing and acceptance. He still felt Isabel's absence deeply, but slowly he was learning to live with that pain, and more importantly, to find peace in everything she had left him. The moments he shared with Isabel would never fade. They had shaped him in ways he could never have imagined. The Javier who now walked the streets of Villa del Valle was no longer the rebellious, angry boy he once was. He had found a new meaning in life, and that meaning was directly tied to the lessons of love, strength, and resilience that Isabel had planted in his heart. Javier became more deeply involved in the school, becoming a role model for the children. The closeness he now shared with them went beyond a sense of obligation. It was something that filled him. He helped with activities, talked to them about their dreams and worries, and often found himself thinking about what Isabel would have said or done in each situation. Her presence was still there, invisible but powerful. One afternoon while walking through the school, Javier was approached by Clara, the little girl who had followed him since the beginning of his community service. She tugged on his arm, a bright smile on her face. "Uncle, can you help me finish my drawing?" she asked, holding a notebook with a colorful sketch. Javier smiled and bent down to see what Clara had been drawing. It was an image of a large tree, with children playing around it, just like he and Isabel used to do with the children in the square. The drawing moved him, reminding him of the simple yet meaningful moments he and Isabel had shared. "Of course," he said, picking up a pencil and sitting down beside her. "Let's finish it together." Clara looked at him with admiration, something he never thought he could inspire in someone. At the same time, that look made him realize how much he had changed. Before, Javier had run from any kind of connection or responsibility, but now he embraced them. He knew that his journey with Isabel had not been in vain. She had awakened something in him that he hadn't known existed, the desire to care for others and genuinely invest in them. At home, Javier's relationship with his mother, Mercedes, had also transformed. They now shared more than just physical space. There was an emotional reconnection between them. Mercedes, seeing how much her son had matured, tried to offer him the support she hadn't been able to give in the past. Javier, in turn, began to see her differently, realizing that she too had suffered and that, like him, she was also learning how to move forward. One night, while having dinner together, Mercedes commented on how proud she was of how Javier was handling everything. "You've found a path, son. I know it hasn't been easy, but you've changed so much." Javier, now more comfortable talking about his feelings, smiled at his mother. "I think it was Isabel. She showed me that I could be a better person." Mercedes nodded, visibly moved. "She left a beautiful legacy, Javier, and you're honoring it." His mother's words touched Javier deeply. He knew he would carry Isabel in his heart for the rest of his life. The longing hadn't faded, but the pain was no longer as unbearable as before. He had learned to accept that even in her physical absence, Isabel was still present in every choice he made, in every act of kindness, in every smile he brought to the children at school. A few months later, Javier found himself back in Villa del Valle's central square. The same tree where so many of his conversations with Isabel had taken place stood firm, with its new leaves swaying in the breeze. It was a place he often returned to, as if Isabel's spirit still lingered in that space where they had connected in such a special way. He sat on the bench and closed his eyes, letting the soft sound of the wind envelop him. The pain of loss was still there, but now there was something more, a sense of peace, of acceptance. Javier knew that life would move forward, and that he too must move forward. The transformation Isabel had caused in him was her greatest legacy, and he promised himself that he would honor that legacy in the best way possible, by being the person she had helped him discover. As he opened his eyes, Javier watched the children playing around the square, laughing and running, just as Isabel had always loved to see. He stood up, walked over to them, and joined in, helping them with whatever they needed. Isabel's love, her legacy, lived on in these small actions. In every smile he offered the world, Javier had found his new path, his new status quo. He was no longer the lost, angry boy. He was a man who had discovered the power of love, vulnerability, and connection. And even though Isabel was no longer physically present, he knew she would continue to live on inside him, guiding him with every step. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more heartwarming stories like this. We have new videos every week, and if you want to be even more inspired, click the video that's now appearing on your screen. We have many incredible stories waiting for you. See you in the next video.